for GPI, and I have the honor of chairing the session today. Before we get started, I just want to highlight a few housekeeping rules or points. Please note that this event is being recorded and will be made publicly available. And I think in about a week's time, it should be up on our website. To avoid any disruptions, only the speakers' cameras and microphones will be active during the session. And as I said, if time allows, there will be a Q&A session following the speakers. But please feel free to just pop your questions in the chat, and we'll keep an eye on that throughout the session. Our speakers might be able to also answer, especially if the one is going first, they might be able to answer your questions during the session. So I'd now like to give a warm welcome to our speakers today. And our speakers are Lauren van Niekerk and Professor Anne Tarrant. Lauren is a lecturer within the Department of Social Work and Social Development at the University of Cape Town. She is also the Male Engagement Research Fellow at GPI, or within the Global Parenting Initiative. And Anna is a Professor of Sociology, as well as the Research Director of the Center for Innovation in Fatherhood and Family Research at the University of Lincoln. I will now hand over to Lauren just to provide a bit of an overview of gender transformative practices and how this links and can be incorporated into parenting programs. Lauren, over to you.
Thanks, Jen. Good afternoon, good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone joining today. It's wonderful to be part of this webinar, and thank you so much for having me. So as Jen said, I'm going to give you a bit of an overview of gender transformative approaches to parenting programs, and then briefly tell you what the Global Parenting Initiative is currently working on in relation to this. So gender transformative parenting programs aim to challenge traditional gender norms and promote equality within the family context, fostering positive outcomes for both children and parents. When parenting programs incorporate gender transformative approaches, they integrate content, messaging, and dialogue that aims to increase positive gender socialization. It improves parent and child communication and dialogue. It emphasizes the importance of couples communication and promotes non-violent discipline to create more equitable and respectful family dynamics. These programs are really designed to transform harmful gender practices such as gender-based violence, and they support the transformation of imbalanced power structures within families. It's really encouraging to see that in recent years, gender transformative approaches to parenting programs have gained significant attention, as research has consistently highlighted the critical role that parents play in shaping gender attitudes and behaviors in their children. And so a key aspect of gender transformative parenting programs is the active and intentional inclusion of male caregivers. By encouraging fathers or male caregivers to actively participate in these interventions, we can effectively challenge traditional gender norms and promote more equitable relationships within families. And studies have shown that gender transformative parenting programs can lead to more equitable division of household labor. It can improve communication within families, and it can lead to enhanced parent-child relationships by encouraging parents to model non-traditional gender roles and challenge stereotypes. Male engagement in parenting programs is particularly important in countries where gender equality remains a pervasive issue. Research in South Africa, for instance, has linked gender-based violence and social issues to the perpetuation of traditional gender norms within families. And so by involving fathers in these interventions, we can address these underlying gender dynamics and promote more equal and respectful relationships within families. As the Global Parenting Initiative, we are actively working towards the integration of gender transformative approaches into our programs. And this is grounded in the need to advance gender equality, to reduce violence against women and children, and ultimately to create more positive outcomes for families. As part of our gender transformation strategy is the recognition of the critical role that fathers and male caregivers play in children's positive development. And in light of this, we want to ensure that our GPI interventions appeal to and are inclusive of fathers. To do this, we are combining evidence-based research and then the implementation thereof into our parenting interventions. Our research-based components includes a comprehensive understanding of male engagement within parenting interventions through systematic reviews and comparative analysis across our different programs, as well as the development of a battery of quantitative and qualitative measures for measuring male engagement within and across the GPI programs. And then the implementation-based component includes being consciously inclusive of male caregivers by designing messaging, content, recruitment, and retention strategies for parenting programs that appeals to both men and women, as we often find that it's generally women or female caregivers who attend the parenting interventions. And so as part of our ongoing commitment to gender transformation and male engagement within our programs, we continually strive to expand our knowledge, our understanding, and our evidence base with the ultimate goal of enhancing the quality of our parenting programs within the GPI. So we were really delighted when Anna reached out to us, as her research and her work with fathers has been transformative in the field of parenting and family dynamics. Anna's dedication to challenging stereotypes, advocating for father involvement, and understanding the complexities of young fatherhood has not only reshaped perceptions, but has also paved the way for inclusive and supportive practices in parenting programs, and really highlighting the importance of implementing father-inclusive practices in policy and in professional settings, and emphasizing the unique needs of young fathers and the benefits of actively engaging fathers in parenting. So today we have the privilege of learning from Anna's insights and experience, which offer valuable lessons for developing effective and inclusive parenting programs. It's wonderful her research not only challenges societal norms, but also provides a roadmap for creating supportive environments that enable fathers to play an active and a meaningful role in their children's lives. So please join me in welcoming Professor Anna Tarrant, whose work continues to inspire and guide us towards a more inclusive and supportive approach to parenting and family well-being. Anna, over to you.
Thank you so much, Lauren. I have some slides to share, so I'm just going to put those up on the screen now. And hopefully you can see those okay. So can you see my screen at the moment?
Yes, it's coming up.
There we go. Lovely, thank you. So can you see those slides? All right.
Perfect. Thanks, Anna.
Lovely. Thank you so much, both to Jen and to Lauren for those really lovely introductions. As Lauren mentioned, I reached out to GPI with a query around father inclusion and the kinds of work that GPI was working on to explore synergies and connections, and to really think through how we collectively work together to activate change, to implement father inclusion, not just at family level, but more broadly practice and policy. So today I'm going to provide an example from a longitudinal programme of research that I've been leading in the UK, predominantly with an England focus, but try and think through some of the kind of more generalised findings from that work, and encourage people here to think through the potential applications of that work, of the findings, and also think about what works in father inclusion. And then this is part of a much broader agenda around building on the capacity of fathers and their engagement with children, with attention to structural issues, including disadvantages and inequalities that occur. Father inclusion is not necessarily an equal playing field at the moment. So with our focus on young fathers, we're thinking more about how disadvantaged or highly stigmatized dads can also be brought into these conversations, these processes and these movements as well, and over time. So I'm going to be talking to a study that I've directed since January 2020, called Following Young Fathers Further, and provide some examples of both the methodologies, the outcomes and the findings from that research, as well as some of the impacts that we've been having from that work. So right from the outset, I think it's worth saying that this is a qualitative longitudinal programme of research. So Lauren mentioned both quantitative and qualitative measures there in the parenting programmes that she's discussing and engaged with. Our work's predominantly built on interviews and creative engagement with young fathers and with multi-agency professionals to understand their support needs, their engagements with services over time, alongside the perspectives of professionals who also deliver support to families, and that includes low-income families or young parents. And this is very much also an applied fatherhood research study. So impact and transformation and change has really been built into the programme since its inception, really. And because it's funded by a Future Leaders Fellowship programme, which is a prestigious UK-based funding programme all about research leadership, the project's kind of helped me to think very strategically and to shape how we promote knowledge exchange and the evidence base in a way that then leads to change and hopefully in positive directions, and in line very much with gender transformation and the broader impacts that father involvement and engagement can have on family dynamics and family well-being. So I'm going to be talking through kind of a couple of linked projects essentially that have led to Following Your Fathers further and kind of form this longitudinal programme of research. So actually the interest in young fatherhood, empirically speaking, began in the UK in 2010, and that's when the first funded study around the parenting journeys and support needs of young dads received funding and received more detailed attention. This then ran alongside my own research, which was interested in questions of the relationship between fathering and poverty. So I was seeing a lot of discussion and debate about absent dads, deadbeat dads, you know, these very highly deficit-based ideas about men, particularly in low-income circumstances, or at the intersections of ethnicity and race, and actually very little empirical evidence around what their lived experiences were really like. So in that study, I sought to uncover or recover the stories of men in a range of different generational positions who were engaging in their family lives, were sustaining their family lives, albeit in a range of different generational positions. So at that point, I became engaged with the Following Your Fathers study. I did a secondary analysis of some of that data, particularly of a subsample of young dads who are living in low income circumstances, but also looked at primary caregiver fathers and then also male kinship carers. And what that really demonstrates is the ways in which men provision family life over time, but also across the life course as well, and offers a really strong counter narrative that men don't care, which I think is a common assumption that I've been keen to unpick and be critical of over time. But also that they benefit from engagement and involvement in family life, particularly where they're supported by welfare systems and family policy systems. So those two projects kind of connected to each other and kind of came into contact with one another around 2014 to 15. I'm then going to talk a little bit about a project called Responding to Young Dads in a Different Way. So this is where I worked more formally with Bren Neal, who was the director of the baseline study Following Young Fathers. And in that study, we piloted interventions, social interventions funded by research funding from the university to explore how we promote father inclusion. And then these projects as a whole led to, as I say, the Following Your Fathers further study, which was a 4-year programme of research finished in December 2024, although now has another 3 years of funding, where we really consolidated a methodology around father inclusion, thinking about how we promote practice-informed research to encourage research-based practice as a kind of cyclical approach to thinking about how we involve dads more effectively and actually capitalise on the kind of cultural, familial-based shifts we're seeing around men's intentions to be there for their children. So that's kind of some of the context. This work doesn't come out of it doesn't come out of a vacuum either, and some of this kind of more broad kind of trend-based attention, I think, is important, again, as context to some of this work. We do know that dads are more involved than ever before, and that's only set to increase. So it was interesting that just yesterday some analysis came out from a study called The Children of the 2020s in the UK. And again, that was quantitative based analysis that confirmed further gains in fathers taking a greater role in parenting. So we've got these really important cultural and actual shifts going on at the level of family and personal practice and engagement. This has been culturally accepted as well, I would argue more. So there's been this cultural acceptance of father engagement and its value for the welfare of men, women, children and society at large. And that's some of the sort of kind of processes that Lauren was talking about in her introductory section there. But essentially, there's a wealth of interdisciplinary evidence now that points to positive associations between father involvement and then child developmental outcomes across the life course, but then also progress towards gender equality when fathers are recognised and counted in. So these are the gender transformative processes that the research that I've been engaged in and that others are talking about and developing into parenting programmes help to provide the rationale for. The paradox is that fathers in all their diversity remain underrepresented in parenting and family research, and also continue to be considered in a periphery role in family life and as less central to mothers. So albeit there have been some gains, but there is still a lag in the extent to which we actually view and construct men as engaged and involved fathers. And that has implications for the delivery of services and for the ways in which professionals engage with fathers. There's not a blame game here, so I don't want to kind of pit professionals against fathers. What we're seeing in the academic research and in our engagement with professionals is that there are very real barriers to support and engagement with fathers in relation to encouraging their engagement with families and children, and engaging with professionals around what it means to be father inclusive, and how that promotion of the evidence base around what works is core to some of these kind of general processes and this movement, I think, towards affecting social change across a broad ecosystem. Alongside all of this is the deficit narratives that I mentioned earlier. So we know that those on the margins are likely to be stigmatised, more likely to be subject to governance surveillance by professionals, or overlooked as engaged in their families' lives entirely. And again, my focus on young dads is very much about addressing that, demonstrating that just because you're on a low income doesn't mean you're not caring and not capable of caring for your children, and really pushing back against this idea that men are absent and they just disappear forever. My questions are very much driven by where do they go, what happens to those men once they're considered absent from a household or a particular family context. Essentially, my overall kind of driving argument really for much of my research is about how do we address these gaps in the context of these shifts. And actually, I would argue that the evidence around the shift towards father engagement in family and in personal contexts is fertile ground for evolving practice and policy. So I think we're at a really important moment, actually, where we should be able to capitalise on and galvanise the changes that are happening at that personal level and promoting those upwards from the grassroots. So that's kind of core again to what's driving what we're doing. So in terms of the research, what we're trying to do is work towards a shared or collective vision, and that's a vision of father inclusion. Now, this is not a language that I actually started out with when I was developing the Following in Fathers Further research study, but it's a language that certainly the dads that I've been engaging with have been adhering to. It's what professionals have been adhering to in terms of how they develop their practice and thinking about what works, but also has real potential as a powerful language and an agenda, I think, for promoting gender transformation across a broad set of terrains of policy, practice and support. So we know that dads want to be seen as beneficiaries of services. Professionals tell us they don't always know how. So the question that has driven and led a lot of what I'm thinking about is, how do we create a practice and policy ecosystem that's more father inclusive? Again, a lot of my work's been very UK focused, but actually we know that this is an international agenda as well. So I think there is potential for generalizability around these kinds of questions and thinking about how we address fatherhood and their involvement in all their diversity. So this is what we've been essentially trying to work towards. So a bit more sort of detail then about the various projects and the journey that we've gone on. So Following in Fathers started in 2010 technically and officially, but was consolidated in 2012. It was a part of a broader project around young parenthood, and there's some interesting sort of tensions, if you like, around young fatherhood research and father inclusion in general, because of the kinds of policy framings that are relevant to that particular population. Actually what Brem started out being interested in was the experiences of young mums, and again that was influenced by her previous research. So she took that kind of research question to a teenage pregnancy strategy board in the local city where she was conducting that research, and at that meeting there was a request for new evidence about young fathers. So the professionals there were saying, you know, we know actually enough about young mums. There's a bit of a policy and practice emphasis on support for young mums, but we're actually seeing a lot of young fathers who are telling us they want to be there for their children, but they're facing this whole host of structural and individual challenges that mean that's being undermined and it's creating barriers for them. So that study involved then multiple interviews with a cohort of 34 young fathers, and the study traced their parenting journey support needs over time across up to 5 waves of interviews to look at their parenting trajectories and support needs. And this again revealed a whole host of challenges around wanting to be there and be a good father, and they talk in those terms, you know, I want to be a good father. Elements of that is about provision and economic providing, but also elements of this kind of cultural shift towards father engagement, so the more nurturing, caring aspects of fatherhood and really investing in the relationship with the child. They also talked a lot about their engagements with services, and at this point it was really clear that they wanted to be supported by services, and this is people all the way from antenatal and those that they met at the start and the outset of a pregnancy and beyond, basically. And what we saw in those findings was elements of good support where dads were included and they were asked how they were, and there was some kind of holistic responses to those young dads around the kinds of challenges they were facing that, you know, meant that they weren't able to be the father they wanted to be. But also really problematically, we saw aspects of sidelining and surveillance. So some professionals would ignore the young dads altogether. And again, Lauren mentioned the kind of mother-focused attention of much service support, which of course is really, really important. But the father was being kind of not recognised as part of that co-parenting relationship, and therefore not seen as a resource actually to the mom, to the child, and to the broader family unit and well-being. We also saw elements of surveillance. So this was kind of the opposite end of the scale, a very risk-based focus on young dads, assumptions that they may be violent, that they may lead to particular challenges in interpersonal relationships and or towards the child. And those assumptions proved to be very problematic because the dad, again, was either discounted or subject to a great deal of intervention. So of course that's important where that's necessary and needed, and again I think father inclusion speaks to that broad range of needs that might need to be addressed among men. Alongside of this, the surveillance, sidelining, support elements were confirmed by professionals. So interviews were conducted with people in the local authority, by third sector charity organisations, and also health services. And again, what we really learned there is that professionals are undermined by these gender-based occupational cultures in services. They lacked confidence actually and training in how to engage with dads, and it's very interesting, as you know, in all of the sort of training that I deliver, people just sort of say to me, well, how do you actually engage a teenage boy or a young dad? We've got nothing in common. And actually, it's about investing in those relationships and building relationships of trust over time with those young men, trying to find some common ground and treating them as the human beings they are as well. But of course, then that's also undermined by workloads, high workloads, which have got worse in the UK, linked to austerity and funding cuts, and also a lack of sustainable funding as well for both for health services, but also specialist services as well. But essentially, what that project did, it was the first step really in challenging these deficit views of young dads, and we do that through an advocacy for more caring and compassionate practice and policy approaches, and a big part of that is from shifting from seeing teenage parents and young dads as a social problem to thinking about their social engagement. So how can we increase the participation of young fathers and also professionals in addressing these broader challenges that are occurring at these different scales? So responding to young fathers differently was an impact project. It ran for a year. We had a small pot of funding of about £15,000, and we took relationships forwards with professionals who were champions for father inclusion. So they were already doing some really good father inclusive work with young dads in the city. And what we proposed was to trial or pilot 2 practitioner designed and led case studies. So one was creating new pathways of support for young fathers who were leaving the criminal justice system. And then the second was instigating a model of good practice that was already being implemented in London, and that was called the Young Dads Collective. And we sought to bring that model, a revised version of that model and an adapted model of that version of that model to Leeds in the sort of in the middle of England. This involved working with a national charity, a local authority, and then an advanced nurse practitioner. And the idea was that we established the model with the bit of funding that we had, and then promoted and evidenced the new pathways and the models. What was sort of shared between the 2 different models was that both involved work with young fathers as experts by experience. So what we did is we, in the first pathway of support projects from the criminal justice system, was actually followed alongside the young dads as they resettled into the community, and this was again led by Kate Bullman at the time, who had developed a fatherhood model and program in prison, and what she said is that when they come out of prison they basically drop off a cliff in terms of support. No one's there to help them resettle, and very often the language around father inclusion isn't understood by families, and she spent a great deal of time working with the dads to help them get bank accounts, to secure housing, and build all the things needed, the package deal, if you like, for fathers around having a secure home and building relationships with the child, and then also seeking and securing employment as well. The Young Dads Collective model does a similar thing, in the sense that young dads are trained to tell their stories to multi-agency professional audiences about their lived experience of young fatherhood, and they do that as a kind of bespoke training and education offer. So with both of these models, what we did was implemented them, but also evidenced and generated feedback from everybody involved in the system that we were creating, to again create a stronger evidence base about what works and what doesn't, what some of the barriers are, and how they might be overcome. And what we found actually is that project kind of evolved is that while ostensibly separate, actually the young dads who were involved in the criminal justice pathways project started to train to be members of the YDC, the Young Dads Collective, as well, and were able to talk very specifically about their pathways of disadvantage and their trajectories through systems in a way that was really powerful and transformative for those young men. So these were very much pilots, as I say, but with the seeds for kind of a change, I would argue, and for this broader programme of research. So over time, and again through the development of the Following Young Fathers Further study, I've been engaging with the language of co-creation Now, this is a language that has been kind of developed and used, particularly in business, in the area of business and management, but also increasingly it's finding application in public health as well. As a sociologist, it's not a language that we've used particularly often in terms of how we create innovations and how we use research and circulate research findings and evidence to affect social change. But I think it has strong application for that. So the way I talk about co-creation in my own publications and in our work is that we've been using it to bring together young dads with other stakeholders. And in our case, we have a shared objective or vision for addressing their marginalisation and then also promoting positive visions of young fatherhood. And I would just say that even though I'm focusing specifically here and empirically on young fathers, this has had much broader application for all fathers. And actually, I think it speaks across the diverse range of fathers as a population. So I think that's worth just mentioning. So what we're doing, as I say, we're seeing young fathers as experts by experience and involving in the process of co-production, but then also co-design of the interventions as well. Essentially what we're doing is we're generating and promoting new knowledge, and in this case we're doing that to create the new social interventions, which is the Young Dads Collective, and then there's another example I'll talk about a little bit later. We're essentially trying to align research with service development. And in this case, we're creating the services don't already necessarily exist. But again, I think there's options there for this kind of work to nudge and affect change within existing services. But also reposition this as a new method for the social sciences. So capturing the unfolding of these processes as they occur, and also think about the impact of those on the diverse range of stakeholders engaged in them. So I'm trying to formulate or reformulate this new methodology in the context of collective activism, innovation and change in relation to father inclusion. So here are some worked examples. So these are some of the select dads from the Young Dads Collective and the professionals that they've been working with. As I mentioned, this was established originally in London and was acknowledged as a model of good practice by the original team for following young fathers. And actually since then we've created the one in Leeds, but we've also created another version in Grimsby, which is a coastal town with high areas of deprivation on the east coast of England. It's a relatively isolated place. It's very different from Leeds, which is a large city, which has kind of got a very dominant financial industry. Grimsby is an old port town. There's been a high rate of deindustrialisation. There are high rates of teenage pregnancy. So even despite the gains of the teenage pregnancy strategy in the UK, where rates of teenage pregnancy have reduced dramatically, there are still pockets where those rates are high. So there was a need for a dad's group in the area, and then also support for young dads in particular. What's been really fascinating about replicating these models is that as much as we've stuck to kind of a core structure and theory of change, they're both place-based models, and we've had to adapt the models in relation to feedback we've had from young dads, from local communities and professionals around what works in a particular place. So where in Leeds we already had a father inclusive champion in John, who's pictured there with the sunglasses, in the Grimsby Dads Collective we actually had to start that from scratch. We had a professional kind of come to me and say, you know, we want to be more father inclusive, we want to embed this work in policy and practice in the area. We don't know how, and what ways can we do this? So we had to start building the relationships with professionals first and kind of test the feasibility and the acceptability of the model with the locality in order to ensure its longer term success. So that's been some really interesting findings from the model. But essentially, at the core of this model is this theory of change. So again, it's a model of co-production that involves training young fathers training an audience of multi-agency professionals, and then they're encouraged to adapt their practice having heard the young men's accounts. What it does, and again this really kind of prompted my own strategic thinking in terms of the broader fellowship, but it tries to affect social transformation at the multiple levels of the ecosystem, so the policy and practice ecosystem. So what we've kind of evidenced with this model is that it's useful because it enables individual development. So young fathers, as I say, are experts by experience. Across the period of the time that we've been engaging with young fathers, they've really built in their confidence, they've gained new skills. Based off the back of the Young Dads Collective North, 3 of the dads went on to secure employment. It's hard to sort of always measure the kind of causal element of that, but certainly those dads in our follow-up interviews associated their kind of confidence in gaining employment and presenting their skills to their time with the model. It also offers an element of peer support. So young men come together as part of a community with a shared identity. A lot of young men in our research talk about their loneliness and isolation when they become a dad, which has huge impacts on their mental health and their sense of belonging. So being able to come together again with a shared objective of promoting father inclusion is incredibly powerful for addressing some of those kind of more personal, emotional challenges that men experience. It gives them a chance to have a space to talk about being a dad, but also wider social challenges as well. It supports professional education and continued professional education. So as I say, professionals are encouraged to think dad, and we actually after training events ask them to make pledges for practice change as well. The tricky thing with that is kind of the longer term follow-up and actually checking in and seeing if professionals have been able to affect change in their practice. But even by asking people to become sort of self-named champions for father inclusion, that can help them to then influence and shape service design and influence the decision makers of managers in services, and really to distill the benefits for services and then for broader family context around why we need to involve dads and support them. And then finally is also policy change. So these models have really supported the young dads to speak at policy events in the UK, to actually change policies as well so that they include dads. So one of the young dads essentially went to a strategic board for the local authority, and they were talking to midwives, and the midwives talked about father inclusion again at this broader strategic board, and they included dads in the policy documents. And again, there was an opportunity there for them to nudge thinking about dads and how they're included in services. But essentially what they're doing is encouraging this father inclusion in service design that's led from the top as well as from bottom up. So trying to really meet kind of all those objectives across the broad ecosystem. So really powerful. So in terms of our capture of some of this change, just some of the interview data that we've got. So the manager of the model talks about the aim of service change being core, but then they point out that there are huge other outcomes associated with that. So again, all the benefits that come with dads being more involved in their children's lives equate to benefits for family more broadly. They argue, I think, any sort of project that promotes like a level of equality for particular groups is beneficial to everyone, not just the group it's supporting. So I think that really speaks to the kind of gender transformation agenda that GPI is also championing. One of the young dads says, buzzing, loved being listened to. It was not just the work with the professionals, it's about meeting up with other dads when we do the planning. We all want other dads to have a better experience. Again, this really speaks against the social problem narrative. The young dads who engaged in our study, some of them have been engaged in it for over 10 years, and we've interviewed some of them up to 7 to 8 times. And we ask them why they've remained engaged in this process, why they've engaged with the Young Dads Collective. And for them, it's a unique opportunity to engage in a kind of soft politics, I would say, to promote what it is that dads do, to promote their capacity to be there for their children and also for one another. And a lot of them have talked about the challenges they've experienced, and they don't want that to happen to other young men. So again, they're really committed to this kind of progressive approach to support for young fathers, in a way that shifts us from social problem to engagement, I think, to participation as well. And that's what this project really has tried to do and has done. And then just an example of professional feedback. So very small quote here, but I'll think about how to help young fathers. I'll think beyond mums. So yeah, we're starting to again see these kind of these changes. So in following young fathers further, we've expanded all of this essentially. So we've furthered the evidence base about the parenting journeys and support needs of young fathers. We've now interviewed 42 young fathers across the UK, as opposed to a city-centric approach like the original study. And as I say, we followed a subsample of 11 of young men for over a decade. And that's just such compelling, rich evidence around the importance of effective support services, and also the intentions of young men and realised intentions of young men to be there for their children. We've been involved in a process of creating new relational dialogues with anyone supporting father inclusion. We've co-created the Grimsby Dads Collective as this follow-on study, and then also co-created DigiDad, which wasn't in the original plan or proposal for the study, which is an e-learning platform with and for young fathers. And again, I'll show you a video of that in a moment. So in terms of the Grimsby Dads Collective, so I've kind of already covered a lot of this, but we responded to this practitioner identified gap in support for fathers in the locality, brought together a core team to deliver this work, and to kind of oversee the strategies for the work. It was scaffolded by me as the project investigator, or the key director of the study. And again, it was kind of supported by conducting multiple interviews. So we kind of did a qualitative process evaluation as we went through. And actually that enabled us to adapt the model in real time, and explore impact and engagement over time. So that kind of longitudinal approach, I think, is what's really unique about what we've done. It was also interdisciplinary in terms of sustained engagement with different stakeholders from different disciplinary backgrounds and expertise, and demonstrating really that father inclusion is relevant to everybody. So that's again another part of the power of this model. What we've ended up with is a functioning peer support group for fathers, with access now to counselling, family activities and peer support. 14 now regularly attend, and interestingly, with Grimsby, only 2 of those are actually young fathers at this stage. We tried to set up during COVID, so bringing fathers together into a face-to-face model like this was challenging. But actually, again, there was a broader issue around a lack of father-inclusive support for fathers anyway in Grimsby. So we've adapted accordingly, so it includes all dads. We've established a new early years practitioner-led dads, babies and toddler group, which enables dads to come together with their children and to engage in a safe environment with their children. And then a training offer we've renamed Ask a Dad. And so far we've trained 74 professionals and practitioners from a variety of different services. Regionally and strategically, we're also seeing the impact of this work. So here we've got a response to an interview from one of the managers. So for the programme. So Grimsby Dads Collective basically recognise the importance of keeping children safe. Sorry, I've lost my screen, haven't I? Oh, sorry. The credibility of the offer means that there's been a shift in the number and accessibility of advice, activities and services for dads of all age, and then the training of professionals and the promotion and championing of the project has contributed to improvements in the strategic and operational environment in Grimsby, with a positive impact on families' lives. So there's more to this than just bringing dads together. You know, it's very strategic in terms of the kinds of dialogues, relational dialogues we're trying to create, and even just recognition and visibility of fathers, I think, is core to our overall agenda around father inclusion. I'm just going to conclude with a discussion around DigiDad. So this is a slightly different model of co-creation than the Young Dads Collective. This kind of grew during the pandemic. So it was a project that was initially established by a third sector specialist organisation called North East Young Dads and Lads. They wanted to shift their, or they had to shift their offer of support for young dads online. And over time, they've invested more and more in creating a digital e-learning platform for young dads that features them both in video and sort of cartoon form. That project's been co-created by 86 local dads so far, with over 1,100 voluntary hours covering the creative process. These are all people who've been beneficiaries of the charity and kind of needed support around some of the challenges of being a young father. We've now actually had over 40,000 organic YouTube viewers of some of the videos on there, with viewing times in excess of 1,000 hours. Now, the videos focus on a whole range of different things. We have a video series on young men's engagement with courts, and how kind of all the know-how knowledge they need to engage with courts, which can be a very stressful process. We've got a series looking at support and engagement with social workers, but also topics around parenting, so becoming a parent for the first time, engaging with your baby between 0 to 6 months, 6 months to 12 months, and also a project on mental health as well. This is all created, all the scripts and everything are created by again a set of stakeholders essentially. So it's overseen by myself as the lead researcher, but then we also have professional experts who come in and talk about the evidence base, which then is translated into the voices of the young dads who then voice it. And what's amazing is that that's being accessed, not just across the UK but internationally at the moment as well. So as far away as Peru and Indonesia. I don't know if you know the accent of the Northeast, the Geordie accent, but they've got "Why Peru," which is their way of saying great stuff. We're in Peru, so it's lovely. The dads really enjoy being involved in that. It's helped them to become more comfortable in their own parenting and recognise their value and their role as fathers. And we have an artist over here called Sam Fender. I don't know if any of you will have come across his music. But this is Josh in the recording studio for the videos, recording just an hour after Sam Fender had been in the studio. So it's creating these lovely opportunities for participation. I have got an example video, but I'm really conscious of time. But again, a core element to all of this is celebrating young fatherhood, challenging deficit narratives, keeping in mind the challenges that they have to navigate over time, but also raising awareness about that for professionals as well, in a way that we try to seek empathy, compassion, and recognition that, yes, dads want to be there, but they might need a little bit of help to do that. So just in terms of an overview of our methodological journey, so I've named this work kind of longitudinal co-creation. This has been a very long-term, sustained period of engagement, both with young dads, with professionals. We started with the co-production of knowledge involving young fathers. We interviewed young dads. We developed know-how, practice-informed knowledge with young dads about their support pathways with professionals. We then engaged into these processes of stakeholder engagement and co-design, so creating programs, creating interventions that are place-based and or digital, that basically promote more positive social engagement-based perspectives on young dads and then on father inclusion more generally. And then in this final phase, we're co-creating interventions that are being captured and evidenced through qualitative, longitudinal and evidence generation. And in a way, it's a kind of also a form of action research as well. So everything we're creating is adapted in relation to what evidence we generate throughout the process. So this is really the journey we've gone on. And again, I think the kind of evidence-based nature of the work is what gives it the credibility and helps us to build this kind of more compelling evidence-based movement that father inclusion is really important to do. I'm going to wrap up now and just let you know that this work is ongoing. So I've just established a new research centre at the University of Lincoln, which is the Centre for Innovation in Fatherhood and Family Research. Essentially what we're trying to do is build an offer around research, father inclusive training and teaching, consultancy and service evaluation, to really continue this work and embed it nationally and hopefully internationally as well. And we're also in the process of developing a father inclusive Inclusion Hub, which will be an online space and repository for good practice examples and case studies developed by those who are doing father inclusion really well. And a lot of that will underpin the evidence base around what works and also feed into the various offers from the centre. So please do have a look at that, and we welcome international people in our network certainly, and we're keen to learn internationally as well as nationally about what's happening with father inclusion. We also have a project website as well, which talks a bit more about the substantive findings from Following Young Fathers further. And if you want to read about the baseline study Following Young Fathers, Bren Neal and I have just published our book, which came out in February this year, called The Dynamics of Young Fatherhood. So please do follow that up. Some really interesting, I think, interesting evidence, focusing on the microdynamics of their personal relationships, looking at kind of housing, education and welfare trajectories and support needs, and then the co-creation work. So we really try and take the reader on a journey around the evidence and why this works and why it's effective. Just some references there if you'd like to follow up on any of this, and I can provide those too if you want to get in touch. And I think that's me. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Anna and Lauren, actually, for sharing your insights and your wonderful research, Anna, that you've been embarking on. We do have some time for Q&A, and there are a few questions in the Q&A section, which I can just read out. Colleen, and if there's others, if you'd like to raise your hand, if you weren't able to find the Q&A or the chat section, please just raise your hand and we'll see if we can unmute you. But we're going to work through the ones that we have in the Q&A section. So Colleen posed a few questions, so we'll work through that. Can you say the name of the person that developed the fatherhood model in prison? Is it available? She's asking. That's the first question.
Yes.
Okay. And then she said, sorry if you've said this before. What age group were the young dads? When did they graduate from being new young dads? So those two you can answer, and then we'll just look at the rest.
Yeah, really good question. And yes, sorry, usually that is on my slides, so a bit of an oversight there. So in policy and practice terms, in the UK certainly, but also internationally, it refers to anyone who's aged 25 and under when they first become a parent. It used to be that there was a predominant focus on teenage parents in particular. But as things have changed, so as it becomes harder and harder for young people to secure independence as a family, the idea of young has also expanded. So there's some really interesting kind of theoretical work to be done, I think, and subjective work around how we define young. And actually it's very tied to resource and sort of level of dependence on either family or the state. So I think actually we're going to see a shift to even being under 30 being quite young as a parent these days, and that's linked to, again, particularly in the UK, like lack of accessible childcare. It's extortionately expensive now. It's more than people's mortgages in the UK. So and then buying a new house as well, that's expanded exponentially in terms of the kind of deposit you'd need and all of those things. So 25 and under is who we work with, but some of the young men we followed up in the research over time have been past the age of 25 because we wanted to follow them longer term. But what's interesting is they still carry that subjective identity, that kind of stigma attached to being a young father with them. So just as one example, one of the young men is now 30. He had his son when he was 15, and his own child is now 15. So he still feels like a young dad relative to other men who he's engaging with as fathers. So yeah, so that's that response. And then Kate Bullman was the lady in the UK who developed a fatherhood programme in a young offenders institution. She's no longer in the field, unfortunately, but having said that, we have published a report about that work, and I can pop that in the chat and share that with you. that outlines what she did, and how we captured some of that information from her. But again, that was super fascinating. You know, there's clearly a lack of support specifically for dads when they come out of prisons, unless there's a specialist support service available. But that's very much a postcode lottery because of a lack of cohesive policy and funding available to services to provide that kind of specialist work. So hopefully that
Thanks, Anna. Another question from Colleen was, were there specific professionals that needed training?
No, I mean, it's all professionals really. For some, it's a refresher. So some people kind of may have done some of this work at university or elsewhere. But often we are working from scratch, and I think there is a case for seeking to embed discussions around father inclusion across a broad set of curriculum in universities, and I think, you know, it's a real gap actually in people's learning. There's a really fascinating question around the extent to which actually, I think in the context of social work, for example, where there's a lot of talk and training around social justice and around inequalities, but then what happens is they go into the workforce, and then the kind of character of the job and the pressures of the job, the barriers that the systems create, kind of start to undermine some of those things, and particularly around father involvement. So I think there's potential for two bits of change there. So embedding this more in curricula, but then also providing opportunities for training through continued professional development routes as well.
Thank you. Godfrey, your hand is up, and I know we're reaching the top of the hour. So, Lauren, I've seen your questions. We will stay on for a few more minutes if people would like to ask additional questions. Go ahead, Godfrey.
Thank you very much for the opportunity. My name is Godfrey. Thank you, Professor. And Anna, this is really fascinating. I'm sitting here in Uganda and thinking this is fascinating work. I have interest in this, definitely been doing work on parenting and fatherhood. Could you just say a little bit more about the characteristic of these fathers? Did they have partners, or rather were they married? And how was the engagement of their partners, or female or male? I don't know what partners they had. And would that have been an important consideration in this design?
Absolutely. So the baseline study of the 31 young dads, and then we followed it through. It reflects a diverse range of dads from, you know, with different parenting arrangements, different relationship arrangements. Because we followed them over time, and we see them going in and out of relationships with co-parent or with child, with professionals, you know, and I think that's kind of the power of the longitudinal methodology. But we've engaged with dads who were primary caregivers, maybe they may be single, dads who are still in relationships with partner, co-parent. We've got dads who are married. I think there's 2 out of the whole sample who were married. Interestingly, both of them were religious, so they were Christian and connected to the church, and they'd actually met through the church. And for them, being a young parent was different, because they did it on purpose. It was planned, and they wanted to create a family, and that was core to their identities and who they wanted to be. I think it's just worth noting that of the young dads, of the 31 young dads, all of their pregnancies were unplanned, except for the 2 who were already married or you know, in secure relationships. But what we see kind of across that whole diverse range of samples of the sample is they all have that commitment to being there for their children. It's just it's the structures that affect their ability to do that, if that makes sense. And you know, we see some of the young dads in the much more kind of precarious circumstances where children are subject to child protection risk, where they have to go to court. You know, they still really want to be involved in their children's lives, but things like the financial cost of legal aid, or you know, that the ability to actually stand up and speak in a court, they're the things that actually get in the way. And it's those kind of contextual barriers, I think, that we need to pay more attention to. So again, our kind of work with the lived experienced young men is about telling a range of those different stories, where the young men are are happy and confident to do so. And I think that's important to say as well. You know, there's a risk with lived experience presentations that becomes exploitative. But what we do is we ask them to reflect on what they're comfortable reflecting on, and then to encourage professionals to think more holistically about the kinds of things these young men are having to face. So yeah, diverse, a very diverse sample.
Thank you.
Thanks so much for the question, Godfrey. Going back to our Q&A, Lauren van Niekerk, she posed 2 questions. How did you go about recruiting and then retaining the fathers over that period of time?
Yeah.
And were the dads eager to participate in the programs and eager to engage in the sessions, or did their experiences challenge this? Challenge in this regard?
Yeah, really good questions. So our route in was gatekeepers, essentially, in services. So we'd identified John, who was championing young dads in the city, and followed up with some of his young men, and said, you know, there's an opportunity to be involved in this research. Would you like to join? That actually followed a period of trying to identify young dads in schools, but it skewed the sample towards more middle class kind of resourced dads, I would say. So there was quite a diverse strategy, really, of going through different gatekeepers, and you do have to, because you know, we don't necessarily have young dad support groups everywhere across the UK, and that was the issue we had in Grimsby, actually. So we didn't have an evidence, you know, an established group of young dads who we could just drop into and say, let's do this amazing stuff. You know, we had to actually really spend the time working with professionals who might have contacts with young dads. Essentially, you know, you're trying to identify people who've already got relationships of trust with those young men, to then start developing your own relationship with them. One of the mechanisms for us is the longitudinal nature of the research. So when we've actually identified young dads, we've basically said, look, can we get in touch with you again to do a follow-up interview with us? And, you know, people are so generous. Like, I was sort of don't expect it sometimes that people will want to participate in research, and I sort of think, well, you know, this works, this is useful for us, what do you get from it? And I think just kind of having those authentic conversations with the dads and saying, actually, we're doing this because we want your voice to be heard, and we hope that we can have influence and you can be involved in influencing, all of that kind of thing, you know, kind of is a shared vision and a goal which helps to cement those relationships and sustain them over time. My colleagues, you know, they do little drop-ins text, you know, we sort of check in how people are, and again, we say to them at any time, if this is too much or burdensome, you just need to say and we'll withdraw. But they are very committed, and I think they're seeing through the research, through the different interventions, that what they're doing actually is affecting change. So they're sort of seeing a return on that investment in the time, really. What was the second part? Sorry. Oh, the challenges. Yeah. So yeah, I think what I'd say is that our lived experience young men are the more resourced ones as well, in relative to, you know, to the broader group of people who might do this work. With Grimsby Dads Collective, it took us 4 years to get that going properly, because of the pandemic, but then also because some of the young men, especially compared to those in Leeds, were so vulnerable, they were so deprived, you know, or living in such deprived areas. They might already be struggling with addictions, or you know, having troubles in their relationships with co-parent, and actually the work we were trying to do was actually one step too far ahead for them. And again, I think that's just really important insight around, you know, who this model is accessible to. It's certainly not accessible to all the young dads, and I think there's some thinking to do around that, around you know, the limits of co-production and co-creation, and how do we ensure that the stories of the more vulnerable young men are heard. And I think that's actually where the role of the research comes in. So being able to say, look, we've engaged with these young men in these circumstances, and we're able to sort of tell some of these stories alongside those who tell their own stories, you know. And I think that's the power of the collective collaborative work that we do, that it helps to ameliorate, hopefully, and mitigate some of those kind of power dynamics in a way that's participatory. So yeah.
Thank you. Another question from Lauren. Do you have any insight into the gender attitudes of the fathers when they initially joined the program, and whether this changed over time? It's a good question.
Oh, that's a lovely question. Oh, that's a really lovely question, and actually I think that's something we could do some more detailed analysis of, actually. We do have to challenge. there are times when and certainly the professionals we work with have to challenge ideas around gender, and it's quite, it's a slow process. It has to be part of the relationships of trust that get developed with the young dads. It's interesting because a lot of the guys we've sort of interviewed longer down the line are sort of very committed to gender equality, and they start using that language, and I think part of that is about their engagement with professionals. But yeah, I think we don't ask them specifically, or haven't asked them specifically, about their gendered attitudes very early on, but I think we can infer, that we can infer things from some of their responses, around, a lot of them talk about they blame their mums, actually. So if they've had really difficult upbringings, or they've been living in hardship, mum is often the one to blame. Then there's obviously kind of the absent dad as well. So there's an interesting tension with my work around trying to challenge and critique those ideas, when actually it's a lived experience for some of these young men as well. And it's that trying to nudge through the research questions, through their engagements with professionals, around, actually, maybe we don't blame individuals for this. We maybe think about the reasons that have led to these consequences or led to these situations. But yeah, that takes a long period of time, and I'm going to note that as a bit to follow up on, if you're happy for me to do that, because I think that's a lovely question and something to think more about.
Thanks, Anna. Mulabongwe also asked a question, but I think this person has jumped off the call already, but we can answer it. And then when they get the recording, they can definitely access it again. This person says, thank you, Anna, for your presentation. At the beginning, you spoke about using qualitative methods as well as creative strategies.
Yeah.
Is co-creation one of these creative methods, or were you referring to something else?
Yeah, so I consider co-creation to be creative, in the sense that it's not a prescribed research process. We kind of do the work, and we do it intuitively and iteratively, and so some of the creative elements come from responding to the evidence we get, or we generate as we go through, but we have also developed other creative methods within the project. So my colleague Laura Way, one of my team members, has developed zines with the young dads. So we're going to be putting that on our new website soon, trying to visually capture the lives of young dads and their perspectives on being a young dad. And we've also done a photo voice element as well, with a subsample of the young men, with the idea that we try and visually capture the experiences of young father families. So again, that's work that's in development, but we've been trying to use lots of different methodologies, again, to visualize young fatherhood in a different way, as part of this broader agenda of challenging deficit views of them. I think narratives are powerful, and stories around their experiences are powerful, but finding an image of a young dad that's not romanticized is really, really difficult. And I've had that question raised with me before by another sociologist, and the question was prompted by one of my slides. It had a picture that everyone uses. All fatherhood researchers seem to use the same pictures. So longer term, what we'd like to do is create a digital exhibition on our website, with different imagery of young dads that hopefully look more real, and kind of capture some of the nitty-gritty of the experiences of young dads, as well as the more romanticized sides as well. Does that make sense? So we have used those. Yeah.
Thanks, Anna. Last question from the Q&A, and like I said, if anybody wants to raise their hand, they can. Also, just to say thank you to everyone for sticking around, for those who have, just to go through the Q&A. And I've seen that Colleen is still online, so I'm glad that you're still here. Is DigiDads available globally? Is there a cost? We are from the Parenting Partners Caribbean.
It's freely available. So I'll put the address in the chat. It's just DigiDad. I'm just finding it now quickly. digidad.uk. We are actually in the process of updating it, so it's a bit prettier, because it's quite basic at the moment, and I don't think the organisation expected it to grow quite as much as it has. We are introducing a registration for it, so that's purely for us to track who's interested in it, but it's all open and free to access. We wanted to create it as a co-produced output that's accessible for professionals and young dads, you know, and I think being free and open access is core to that. So yeah, please do recommend it. It's, as I say, it has got the Geordie accent in a lot of the videos to kind of sustain its place-based identity, but you can put captions on and things as well. We've had questions from people around accent and, you know, the challenges of sort of understanding different dialects, that kind of thing. So yeah, if you do need the captions, please do pop them on as well. But yeah, open to anyone globally.
Thank you so much, Anna. So we've gone through all of the questions. Thanks, Lauren, and thanks, Anna, again for speaking today. I think it was really useful. I think, as you could tell, there was a lot of interest from people that have joined, and also thanks to all the guests for staying on until the end of the session. And it will be available as soon, I think, by next week, the week after. The recording will be available online for people to go and access as well. So thanks again, and enjoy the rest of your day. Take care, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.